We're not staggering up from some all-you-can-eat buffet. And if you were that zebra, the energy you're mobilizing for your muscles, you're mobilizing it from fat cells in just a couple of seconds. Digestion is slow. It takes forever. It costs a fortune. You're trying to avoid being somebody's lunch. Don't worry about digesting breakfast. And we all know the first step of that. Suppose you get stressed speaking in public. What happens? Your mouth gets dry. You've stopped secreting saliva, the first step of shutting down the whole gastrointestinal tract. Social services or education or any of that stuff. And like after a while, the stress response is more damaging than the stressor, especially if the stressor was some psychological nonsense. Everything you're doing here is penny wise and dollar foolish. It's inefficient. It's less than optimal. All of this is built around it's an emergency. It's an emergency. Fix later, grow later. Don't do it right now. And if every day is an emergency, you pay the price for it. At the metabolic level, mobilize energy because the lion's running after you, no problem at all. mobilize energy from your storage sites chronically because you're chronically psychologically stressed, and among other things, your muscle mass decreases. Muscle is one of your main energy storage sites. You get atrophy of muscle, myopathy. For extremely complex reasons, you're using your energy really inefficiently. For insanely complex reasons, you're now more at risk for adult onset insulin-resistant diabetes. Now, adult onset diabetes is one of those interesting diseases that our great-great-great-great-grandparents never even dealt with. This is a disease of getting older in a typically westernized way, putting on weight, getting more sedentary, and everything down to the molecular level that goes wrong in your cells with adult onset diabetes. Stress exacerbates the process. Same punchline at the cardiovascular level. If a lion is chasing you and your blood pressure is 180 over 120, you're not suffering from high blood pressure, you're saving your life. On the other hand, if your blood pressure is 180 over 120, every time you're stuck in traffic or something, you're not saving your life, you are suffering from stress-induced hypertension. And you do that chronically enough, and you're going to damage your cardiovascular system. Okay, 30 seconds on stress and heart disease. What's the scenario we all know about? Guy gets horrible news and he's wailing about something and he suddenly clutches his chest in pain, keels over dead, sudden cardiac arrest. This has never happened. This is like a movie plot. This never occurs in real life. Instead, what actually happens requires you to have like arcane knowledge of high school physics explaining why like toilet bowl plumbing wears out after a while. You got a tube and you got fluid moving through the tube, and by definition, if the fluid is moving through with more force, elevated blood pressure, you begin to get fluid turbulence pounding away on the walls of your blood vessels, causing little bits of pitting and scarring and tearing, and then you get inflammation there, and then that's exactly where like glucose and cholesterol and fat wants to glom onto to clog your arteries. Where's the glucose and cholesterol and fat coming from? That's the stuff you're mobilizing into your circulation in the previous slide. So you get this synergistic double whammy here between the metabolic stress response and the cardiovascular, setting you up for the #1 killer in this country, cardiovascular disease. Now, this link between stress and heart disease is so solid that it accounts for the most famous personality profile in all of medicine. And it's one where basically if you're coming out to a lecture on a perfectly nice evening to be outside taking a walk instead, I suspect it applies to like 80% of the people in this room, which is those of us in here who have type A personality. Okay, type A personality. Type A was first described in the 1950s by a pair of cardiologists in San Francisco, Friedman and Rosenman. Here was their original formulation: time-pressured, hostile, impatient, low self-esteem, joyless striving. Okay, like 90% of us. And what they observed back there in the 50s was if this was your personality profile, you were more at risk for heart disease. Cardiologists hated these guys. You're some like Eisenhower cardiologist, and all you're thinking about is like blood lipids and heart valves, and here are these guys saying, no, you need to sit down with your patient and talk to them. Christ, who wants to talk to their patients and talk to them and say, okay, so suppose you're in the supermarket and you pick the line that's moving slowly. Do you go berserk at that point? That's got something to do with heart disease? Total resistance to the concept. And it wasn't until the 1980s that enough studies had been done that it became clear type A is for real big time. If you have type A personality, you are more at risk for cardiovascular disease than if you smoke, than if you are overweight, than if you have elevated cholesterol levels, a huge risk factor. Now, what became clear by the 80s was the critical component in the type A profile, the piece that is the one that contributes to the cardiovascular disease. And it's a term now that is used in the field if you have toxic hostility. Toxic hostility, this attributional style where everything that happens around you is proof that they're out to get you more than everyone else, and the only thing to do is watch your back 24/7 and keep a knife ready. This is the style where you're in the supermarket and you've picked the slow line and you want to kill the son of a bitch kid behind the cash register. Come on, how do you know I have a 1 o'clock meeting trying to screw me up? No, don't ask the old lady how she is today. Come on, I'm going to die someday. If this is what you're doing, instead of checking out the Elvis sightings in the National Enquirer, your blood pressure is going to go up. And if this is what you're doing every time somebody could have held the elevator door open for you but didn't, if you're doing this 40 times a day, you're going to pound away at your blood vessels set up for cardiovascular disease. And these days, the main question in that field is, insofar as you are toxically hostile, what's worse for your heart? Expressing those toxic emotions or keeping them repressed inside? What's clear is expressing them is worse for everybody else's cardiovascular health, but what is the cost of repressing strong physiological emotions? So that's an area of a lot of ongoing research. Okay, so that's stress and heart disease. Actually, how did those guys first figure out about type A personality, given how much that was coming out of left field? And I actually got to hear this story some years ago out of the horse's mouth himself. Meyer Friedman, the cardiologist who first described type A, died a few years ago in his early 90s, saw his last patient a week before he died, was working full-time at a cardiology unit, UCSF Medical Center. As he used to say, I'm still type A, but I'm a type A tortoise now. And here's the story he would tell. In the 50s, he and his partner had this cardiology practice. Everything was going great, except for this one weird thing, which is they were spending a fortune having to reupholster the armchairs in the waiting room. What's this about? Who knows? Whatever. It's part of the overhead. Every month this upholsterer comes and there's a chair or two that needs to be fixed. One month the upholsterer is out on vacation. Replacement upholsterer comes in, takes one look at the chairs and discovers type A personality. He says, what is wrong with your patients? Nobody wears out chairs this way, and they have one of them left. And as you can see here, the front 2 inches of the armrests and the seat cushions are totally shredded, and the rest of the chair is perfectly fine. It's like every night there's like dwarf beavers in there clawing away their chair. What is this? This is the type A profile. This is somebody with type A personality. This is what they do to a chair when they're waiting in the waiting room with their cardiologist to hear if there's bad news or not. This is not just figuratively, but literally sitting on the edge of your seat and squirming and clawing and all of that. This is what somebody who's type A does to a chair in that circumstance. Okay, so what happens at that point if science is working right? And Friedman should grab him and like, good God, man, what you've discovered, or like midnight conferences between upholsterers and cardiologists, or teams of idealistic young upholsterers sweeping across America and coming back with the news that no, you don't find chairs like these in podiatrists' offices. That's what should have happened. What happens instead, here's where 90-year-old Dr. Friedman starts looking all sheepish. He says, I told my nurse, get this man out of here. I'm this important cardiologist. I can't waste my time with him. Give him this damn check. Get him out of my face. He was too type A to listen to the guy. And it wasn't until about 5 years later that he collaborated with these psychologists, and back came the type A profile. And they said, oh my God, the upholsterer, he was right. To this day, they have no idea who that guy was. Now let's see, it is late afternoon in San Francisco. I'm willing to bet there's some bar in San Francisco right now where there's like this 110-year-old retired upholsterer. And get this guy going, and he's gonna go on and on about how he discovered type A personality, exactly what occurred. So one of the dark chapters in my profession. Okay, moving on, digestion. Shut down your digestive system for 2 minutes running for your life. It's not a big deal. Shut it down chronically, and there's all sorts of gastrointestinal disorders you're more at risk for. Most famously, ulcers. Back to Selye in the 1930s, the first stress-related disease. Stress causes ulcers, canonical knowledge. Everybody knows this. And then about 25 years ago, there's this revolution in ulcerology. Turns out there's a bacteria called Helicobacter pylorus. Turns out the bacteria is responsible for about 90% of ulcers in the West. It gets into your stomach, it generates oxygen radicals and blows holes in the walls of your stomach. It's a bacterial disorder. This was an enormous contribution. The two guys who discovered it gets the Nobel Prize. Amazing. The evening this is announced, every gastroenterologist on earth goes out that evening and celebrates. This is the greatest news they've ever heard, because they're not going to have to sit down their patients and make eye contact and say, if you have any stress, it's got nothing to do with stress. Here's some antibiotics, get out of my office. It's got nothing to do with stress. It's got everything to do with stress, because only 10% of people with the bacteria get the ulcer. You've got to have the bacterial risk factor, but you've got to have a lifestyle risk factor overlapping as well, stress. Stress does not cause ulcers. The bacteria does. What does stress do? When you got an ulcer beginning to start, your stomach's reasonably good at repairing it, at rebuilding the wall there before the ulcer gets troublesome, unless you're chronically stressed. And every day your stomach walls are saying, do it tomorrow, do it tomorrow. It feels like we're being chased by a predator. Psychological stress shuts down the reparations there. So here we have a classic example of interactions between the organic causes of disease and the psychogenic. Stress is still very relevant to making sense of ulcers. Next, growth. Shut down growth for 3 minutes while you're running for your life, not a big deal. Our theme by now, shut it down chronically. This can be problematic, especially if you were a kid. All kids are big long-term building projects. And for reasons of psychological stress, you keep saying, do it tomorrow, you can impair growth. And at an extreme, you have one of the truly bizarre outposts of medicine, a disease of kids who stop growing for reasons purely of psychological stress, known as psychogenic dwarfism, psychosocial dwarfism, stress dwarfism. These are kids who are years behind the normal growth rates, and there's no disease. They're not malnourished. There's no parasites. You check their bloodstream. There's like no growth hormone. You give them synthetic growth hormone. Nothing happens. The whole system is shut down. And at that point, you start poking around in their background, and often out comes some appalling psychological stressor. And the amazing thing is, get them out of that stressful setting, technical term, do a parentectomy on them, and growth will resume at that point. This is incredibly well understood how this works. Open up any textbook of endocrinology, go to the chapter on growth, and I guarantee there will be the obligatory picture of the stress dwarfism kid. You know, those pictures, the stunted kid who's like naked in front of the growth chart with a rectangle over the eyes, and turn the page, and I guarantee there's the obligatory follow-up picture. The kid in a different environment 2 years later, he's like 6'14", he's playing for the NBA. It's everything's, you know, there's still the rectangle and nakedness, but everything else gets better. And what you see there is, this is the system with an amazing capacity to recover. Remarkable cases of this. For example, this was a case report a few years ago. This was a child brought in from an extremely abusive psychological setting into New York Hospital with stress dwarfism, and is documented in the paper. At the time he came into this pediatric unit, 0 growth hormone in his bloodstream. Over the next few months, he became very close with one nurse there, and this was like the first normal emotional relationship of his life. After a couple of months, normal growth hormone levels for his age. At that point, the nurse goes on vacation. By the end of her 2-week vacation, he's back down to 0. Nurse comes back. A week later, he's back up to there. Think about this. The rate at which this child was depositing calcium in his bones could be entirely predicted by how safe and loved he was feeling in the world. You can't ask for a much better example of what's going on here affects every outpost in the body. Now, the issue with stress dwarfism, amid people understanding exactly which hormones are doing what, the issue, of course, becomes how common is this disease? If you were shorter than average and you were not obviously malnourished as a kid, are you a victim of stress dwarfism? Did your parents do that to you? No, this is not like, oh, very stressful childhood, we were moving all the time. This is not like acrimonious divorce. This is nightmare psychopathology. This is the police and the social workers breaking down the door of an apartment and finding the kid chained to the radiator and smeared in excrement and just nightmare stuff, and get the kid out of that setting, and there's recovery. The clinical consensus is this is a once-in-a-career disease that you see extremely rare. Except it's not so rare. It pops up all over the place. Kids in war zones, kids in areas of civil strife. A research assistant of mine and I think we've got the data to show that kids who wound up in the Japanese-American internment camps in World War II had mild stress dwarfism. It pops up all over the place. One classic study in the 60s, looking at rites of passages from cultures all over the planet. Rites of passages, in one culture, they take you out of the desert and stake you down and cover you in poison ants. And some other culture, you play the piano for your grandmother and her friends, or whatever's done in your tribe. They did like 80 tribal comparisons. They controlled for genetics. Back comes the finding, stressful rites of passages during the first few years of life, 2 inches shorter as an adult. Big effect. Let me tell you about the single creepiest example of stress dwarfism I've ever heard of. If for some inexcusable reason you ever find yourself reading chapter after chapter about growth hormone, you're going to notice there's a weird thing, which is a lot of the chapters make reference to Peter Pan. Some quote from Peter Pan or some snide comment about Tinkerbell. I'd seen this for years. I had no idea what this was about until one day I stumbled on an explanation. And this was a chapter about the psychological regulation of growth, and it was talking about stress dwarfism, gave the following case history. 8-year-old boy growing up in Victorian England in the 1870s. One day he sees his beloved older brother killed in front of him in an accident. This destroys the family. There were no other siblings. The father was like emotionally non-existent. This was the mother's favorite child. And in this Victorian swoon, she takes to her bed with the shades drawn for the next 10 years. This kid growing up in this horrible emotional isolation, he goes into the bedroom with a tray of food for his mother, and she's saying, "Oh, David, David, is that you? David, have you come to me? Have you, David, the dead son? David, are you finally, oh, it's only you." Growing up being only you. Apparently, the only thing she ever spoke to him about was this idea she grabbed onto, which was, if David had to die, he'll always be my perfect little boy who never grew up and became a man who didn't need his mother anymore. He'll always be my perfect little boy because he didn't grow up, didn't grow up, didn't grow up. This kid hears this with a vengeance. Middle-class family, no evidence of disease or malnutrition. Boy stops growing there at age 8. Lives to age 60, 4'10" as an adult, unconsummated marriage. Incredible example of stress dwarfism. And then the chapter concludes by informing us that as an adult, this was the author of the much beloved children's classic, Peter Pan. This was J.M. Barrie, the guy who wrote Peter Pan, who's incredibly screwed up. This guy, all he did was crank out book after play after novella about boys who die and come back as ghosts and marry their mothers. His private journals were full of sadomasochistic fantasies about little boys. This guy spent the rest of his life dealing very unsuccessfully with his stress dwarfism. So think about that the next time you see Johnny Depp up on a movie. Okay. Next, reproduction. Your gonads are not going to be working very well if you were chronically stressed. If you were a female mammal of virtually any species, if you were chronically stressed, your cycles will become irregular, lengthened, they may stop altogether. Stress-induced amenorrhea, stress-induced anovulation, and people understand exactly how those work, which hormones are working at the brain, at the pituitary, at the ovaries, at the uterus to shut things down. Let me tell you about one of those steps, because it's got to do with a very weird thing that female mammals do, including human females, which is they secrete a certain amount of male sex hormones into the bloodstream, hormones that are related to testosterone, androgen-type hormones. They come out of the adrenal glands, not a ton of the stuff, maybe 5% the levels you would see in the male. Nonetheless, you got to get rid of it. Unfortunately, female mammals come with this enzyme in fat cells that takes circulating androgens and does biochemistry 101 and converts them to estrogens. Great, perfect, problem solved, everyone lives happily ever after. What if you're stressed? What if you're stressed like the locusts have come and eaten your crops and you're subsisting on 800 calories a day? What if you're slowly starving? Your fat stores are slowly getting depleted. And at some point, you have too little functional fat cells to do the androgen to estrogen conversion. One problem is there's now a little bit less estrogen in the bloodstream. Bigger problem is the androgen levels build up there, and that shuts down every step in the system. That's why starvation shuts down ovulation. That's why voluntary starvation, anorexia, does the same. And that's why some women who do massive amounts of exercise will stop ovulating as well, because you get below a critical fat-muscle ratio there. Now, this is something that's been studied at length. In girls, for example, it's always studies of very serious ballet dancers or gymnasts. What you see is significant delay in the onset of puberty. One study, for example, this was done on the Olympic gymnastics squad from Romania, you know, those 60-pound 15-year-olds getting the gold medals all over the place. What was the average age at which these kids started menstruating? 19. 12.5 is the Western average. Once hitting puberty, women who do tons of athletics, has best studied long-distance runners, women who run an average of 40 to 50 miles a week. That's typically the range where fat stores are getting below threshold, where you begin to have ovulatory irregularities. I can tell you the exact same story about men. Men who run 40, 50 miles a week, sperm count goes down, there's mild testicular atrophy. Okay, wait a second, I thought exercise was good for us. Exercise is good for us, and in fact, a lot of exercise is very good for us. That doesn't mean, though, that an insane amount of exercise is insanely good for us. It means at some point, too much of a good thing is just as bad as too little. You've passed a point of homeostatic balance. And all you need to do to get an appreciation for that is imagine you sit down some hunter-gatherer from the Kalahari Desert and say, you know, where I come from, we have so much food and so much free time that sometimes we'll just go run 26 miles in a day for the sheer pleasure of it. And they're going to say, are you crazy? That's stressful. I mean, throughout hominid history, if you're running 26 miles in a day, either you are very intent on eating somebody or somebody's intent on eating you. This is not normal physiology. So we get a cautionary note here. Meanwhile, over at the male end of things, with the onset of stress, down go testosterone levels. Anesthetize a guy, slice into his belly for surgery, 10 minutes later, testosterone is plummeting. First-year male medical students during exam periods, down go testosterone. Drop the rank of a male baboon in the hierarchy, down goes testosterone. Here's a stressor which, thank God, I have no personal experience with at all. But apparently, it's not fun to be in the Marines. Apparently, it's kind of a drag, especially during basic training. This was this classic study, 1970, New England Journal of Medicine, looking at military recruits during basic training, where now on top of everything else, they had to pee into little Dixie cups for the psychiatrist, and back comes the finding. Guys in the Marines during their first couple of months of service, they have the circulating androgen levels of like Vatican choir boys. That's how much the system is shut down. Okay. So people understand exactly which stress hormones are working at the brain, the pituitary, and the testes to shut down testosterone synthesis during stress. The question you gotta ask at this point is, so what are the consequences of testosterone levels declining during stress? And amazingly enough, the answer is there's no